So this is the panel that everyone really actually wanted to hear. I know it, so thanks for staying. As most of you know, this is like my favorite time of year in Hong Kong. The weather's getting better. There's lots of things to do outside, and SIS, of course. So when we were speaking this weekend and trying to prepare for this panel, this fireside chat, I was talking to some of my friends, and they said, well, what are you going to speak on this time? And I said, well, of course, regulatory and compliance. That's what I tend to be known for in the market. They said, oh, but compliance, what's new in compliance? And I said, oh, yeah, that's probably right, not terribly exciting. But I said, compliance in the Web3 era, in the metaverse. And I got perplexed looks to deer in headlight looks to like, well, that's going to be perhaps the fastest and easiest fireside chat ever, because there's nothing really to talk about. What do you mean that you're going to have compliance in the metaverse or in Web3? That actually tends to indicate that there's actually regulation in place. So I think some of the things that Alice and I want to talk about today, happy to speak about after the panel as well, is there really a need to regulate? Is there a desire to basically have the metaverse regulated? I may ask for audience participation, so forewarning, if everyone wants to get coffee now, they'll probably get up and leave. I'm Kristi Swartz. I'm a partner at DLA Piper. This is my colleague, Alice Lee. And before we get started, maybe I'll just do a general poll. I don't have the fancy apps and stuff. Does everyone think that there should be regulation in the Web3 or in the metaverse? Let's go for that. Yes, no? Any show of hands? Should it be regulated? Should it not be regulated? Don't know? So I think some of the things I wanted to ask Alice, and this is based on some of the things we're seeing in the firm and some of the things that we're experiencing and trying to figure out. Alice, basically, let's start out by, how do you see the current state of compliance in Web3 from a legal perspective? I mean, where is that lens? What do you see? What do you think the trends are going to be?
Yeah, from the reaction, we understand that everyone wanted to be regulated, right? But unfortunately, right now, there seems to be not much going on in this space, in Hong Kong at least. We have the current VATP regime and the upcoming VAS regime. But apart from that, there's not much Web3 or e-commerce specific legislation and regulation right now.
Right, so moving on with that, do you think that basically some of the things I've read about over the weekend, they were saying that some of the regulation needs to be thought about more clearly, we need to have strategic thinking, but others suggested that this is trying to kind of push a square peg into a round hole. Do you think that Web3 requires a new regulatory thinking? Do we think that there needs to be more regulation, less regulation? Where are we standing on this?
I think I agree with the sentence. We do need a new thinking because, like right now, a lot of our clients, when they want to launch an innovative product, because their product does not fit into the current framework squarely, they have to spend a lot of time and money in advance to do the thorough analysis. Sometimes they may end up having to do jurisdiction shopping. They have to find a jurisdiction that allows them to do what they want to do, set up a complete new legal structure for it, or even to redesign their product. So there's a lot of frustration and time and money wasted in this area. But although it's very clear that we understand why the regulators are hesitant to change, because the current framework works perfectly for traditional trade, but we are migrating to Web3 era. Not simply putting traditional trades online, is way more than that. So we need regulations that will address a new business model, new organization structures such as a DAO, which is really popular right now. And we need regulations to tell businesses that what they can do and what they cannot do, and provide consumer confidence to take part in the Web3.
Speaking of DAOs, let's talk about DAOs. I'm sure everyone in the room knows about DAOs. We've started to see actually litigation in the space of DAOs. We've been looking at this. Very curious organization structures, as we would say, because if they're not completed completely, as in you don't set it up properly, it doesn't quite work how it's supposed to. And there's a lot of thought and around the fact that, should it be regulated? It's part of this kind of Web3 metaverse extension now. But the question is, do we think it should be regulated? Because technically speaking, it was supposed to be a self-governed entity. And most people are opposed to the fact that if you set up something to be self-regulating, kind of decentralized as a whole, why in the world would we now start to say we want it to be regulated? I guess, Alice, based on some of the things that we've seen in this case, what do you think?
Well, the case has actually been really interesting. I think it might be one of the first in Hong Kong, actually. So how the case all started is because DAO is not a legal structure that's recognized in Hong Kong. People just don't know who are actually the owners, who are the beneficiaries, and the DAO asset belongs to who. So there's so much confusion, and sometimes because the founders are so distracted from the fundraising, token issuance, they just forgot about completing the setup or putting it in place properly. Sometimes they might not even realize that they're doing that for not their own benefits. There might be other beneficiaries involved. So in this case, we can see a lot of loophole and gray area that people don't understand, that can get trapped into disputes. So I think regulations in this sense will provide some protections and benefit.
That's right. So let's do a quick vote. Do we think DAO's regulated? Not regulated. Let's go regulated. Anybody think DAO? Yeah, let's regulate. Anybody? Don't know? Oh, we've got a very interesting opinion here. Nobody wants to regulate DAOs. So let's move on to NFTs, because NFTs actually are the other one that are quite controversial, because as lawyers, and in doing some work that we've looked at, 6 months ago, if you asked me, do I think do NFTs need to be regulated, or is it a space that we think ought to be regulated? Most people say, oh, NFTs are harmless. What in the world are you doing regulating an NFT? That's nonsense. However, I think they're a little bit more, I'd say, devilish and dubious in some of the assets in which they hold, or some of the activities in which they basically look into. So I think there's a lot of debate around this. Do you regulate, do you not regulate NFTs? Alice, what do you think on that?
I don't think it's a black and white answer. It really depends on what the NFT are for, what are the underlying assets. For example, like with Toco, we do a lot of tokenization project. There could be art tokenization or real estate tokenization. So they're expensive, high value asset being involved, and these investors put in a lot of money, investing a lot of money, they expect return. So these sort of NFT arguably should be higher risk and should be looked after. But for example, if I tokenize my son's art into an NFT and sell it, auction it for a school fundraising project, those are pretty harmless. So it really depends on the whole structure and how you organize it. And so that's why we work with Toco very closely to make sure our clients' product are compliant and certify the regulations.
So around this new thinking and new regulatory ideas, we get into kind of compliance, non-compliance. Do you think there should be cornerstones for the new thinking in the Web3 generation?
I mean, take a step back to look at online transactions, right? What's important to us as people involved in the transactions? We want to know who are we dealing with, what are we buying or selling, and then we will be able to enforce our legal rights if anything goes wrong, and that we are doing it in a law compliance way. So based on those, I think the few things are very important. First of all is identification, KYC. We need to know who we are transacting with. If anything goes wrong, who we can go after to sue. And then for most importantly, that we are not going to deal with sanctions people, right? So secondly, with consumer protection. So we need to know that the things that we're transacting, we have the right, correct legal title attached to it. You also user data protection, cybersecurity. Like for example, the DAO example, right? We need to know that the token holder, the DAO member, ultimately will get the benefit what they entered into for. So lastly, of course, AML, which is paramount for every jurisdictions, right? So that's everyone's top priority. So I think all these three are very, very important.
So moving on to different jurisdictions, what do we think? We've mentioned kind of the three most important: the AML, KYC, FATF compliance, investor protections. Those are the most important thing, I think, in any jurisdictions you can't probably compromise on. But what do you see in other jurisdictions, and where do we see that this Web3 kind of regulation train moving to?
Different jurisdictions moving in different pace, right? But most of them are still in a development stage. Some of them are taking a more willing to take more risk to have a more principle-based approach, so their regulations are more drafted more high level and flexible. But some are taking a more traditional rule-based approach. But although this provides less flexibility, but they might provide more clarity. So there are pros and cons in either model, but at the same time, when we look at them holistically, all of them are surrounding the cornerstone we just talked about, right? KYC, AML, and consumer protection.
So on that note, I'm just going to add 2 cents worth, is that, I think in Hong Kong, we haven't seen much movement, and I'm just going to add my 2 cents aside. We haven't seen much movement. As Alice said, there's not much new law, new regulation. And I think one of the things we have to always bear in mind is when you have regulatory framework from a TradFi position, it's super hard to move into this new virtual asset Web3 metaverse space, because you're dealing with regulators who have a lot of legacy work, a lot of legacy law, a lot of different regulators. So I think one of the things you have to think about is that it's not an easy task. We've looked at this for several different jurisdictions. What can I do better? What do we need to do? How can we use, for instance, DAO structures in a better way? So I can't say that I basically fall a favor and sometimes in the path of the regulator, but I do have to say they have a fairly complicated task in front of them when they try to basically figure out how to navigate this space. As I always say, the law is reactionary. We don't sit there, and most of the time you won't find most governments just creating law and passing law for the sake of it. So it's going to be something that basically is a needed aspect of it, rather than having the law just there, just in case we need it. But do you think Web3, moving on, will be completely decentralized with regulators addressing cornerstones you've mentioned before? Or do you think we're going to be kind of stuck in this space for a long time?
This is a difficult one. Shall we ask audience for what they think?
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay, so do we think that in the next year or two that Hong Kong will actually find Scott, you can't answer this one actually. Do we think that actually there's going to be any movement in this space? Do we have a positive vote for Hong Kong? Yes, no? No? Yes, okay, yay, we've got a few. I think it's a very difficult one, because the regulation, as I say, is playing catch up, and I'm not particularly sure. But we have seen, at least from a Hong Kong perspective, we have seen several kind of closed door meetings happening, some questions saying what do we need to be doing better. I do think there's going to be some jurisdictions that are doing it a lot better already, but maybe perhaps it's because they don't have some of the legacy issues, as we mentioned before. But
back to the question whether it would be completely decentralized, I think it would be tough, because at least for the short to mid-term, probably will be a hybrid situation, I think. So just take KYC, for example, right? So if you want to comply the KYC regulation, but at the same time protect, not to disclose too much personal sensitive data, probably you will need some government authority to issue a token for you to use a virtual ID to transact on Web3, or you will have to use some third-party KYC service provider to do some off-chain verification. So it will be tough under the current framework to completely decentralize.
I tend to agree, actually. I'd like to move on to a very positive space, and shout out to the Toko team here. Toko is a wholly owned subsidiary of DLA Piper, so of course we work very closely with them. And we want to talk about Toko, actually. They have just received a MVP license from Dubai to do some of the things that we're trying to accomplish in Hong Kong, but haven't quite been able to do so. So let's talk about Toko, and maybe Alice, you can talk about some of the things that we do with Toko and some of the very exciting, more interesting, positive sides of what we are doing and what we're seeing in the space in virtual assets in Hong Kong.
Yeah, well, we do a lot of interesting projects in Hong Kong. I think a lot of them are one of its kind in Hong Kong, right? So we do tokenization project with Toko with concerned arts as well real estate, for example. So Togo will look after the technical aspect of the project and work with the client on the tokenomics, while we will look after the legal side. We will do the legal analysis, regulatory compliance advice, and also advice on legal structure and to help the client to set up the legal structures.
So with that, when we look at the TOCO side of things, where do we find that there's some, I guess, bottlenecks, hiccups, or things as maybe some like to say, or issues around where we don't think it's going to take off in Hong Kong, we're going to have to go someplace else to do this? Where do you think the bottlenecks occur, and how do you think that it's going to be solved perhaps in future?
So we can see that it might be sometimes quite difficult for projects to take off in Hong Kong, because most of the tokenization project we are involved with security tokens, right? And in Hong Kong, there's only one fully licensed entity who can trade security tokens, and one which is in AIP stage. So while there might be a principal market and demand for security token, there isn't a secondary market. So we do see a bridge here, a gap here to be filled, and we are hoping the TOCO can fill this space.
So do we see any areas where that maybe the regulatory aspect of, or the compliance bit of it would get in the way and not allow us to basically do such deals from end to end in Hong Kong?
I don't think so, because I think, the Hong Kong government's been supportive. The regulators are very supportive. They are actually very willing and open to learn about all these new ideas, right? They have been keeping in contact with us. They came to see us, right? So they might be a bit, taking time to get there, but they are surely heading in the right direction, I think. What do you think?
I'm going to actually be the contrarian one of the group. I think actually Hong Kong basically does a lot of things right. I think the regulatory framework around this is flexible enough to allow some of this to, I guess, get that round peg into a square hole. But I think, unfortunately, in my opinion, the latest message from the SFC is slightly concerning in the fact that they were before mentioning, I don't ever want to be interested in cryptocurrencies, I don't want to do crypto at all. Now we have this vast regime, which, they said that's well within our remit because it has to do with intermediaries, and that's what we license. But however, the two, as Alice mentioned, there's one that's basically fully licensed and one with AIP condition in place. When you're looking at end-to-end solution for doing tokenization, the two persons that potentially have the licenses do not have the setup to do brokerage. So how can you get the tokenization off the ground? And then, of course, that doesn't mean that you can forget about, what about secondary market issuances? So in other jurisdictions, I think like Middle East and Dubai, I think ADGM, I also feel that Singapore, loathes me to say it, I must admit, but Singapore has actually got their head around this a bit better, quicker, and has gotten the licensing done in a not neater fashion than we have here. And it's actually addressed the fact that, people want to do these types of deals. I think people want to be regulated. People want it to be clear, and they want direction on how to do certain things. And I think that's where I think Hong Kong, they're playing catch up, which is a bit of a pity. But I do think that it's not impossible, but there does need to be some pretty, I think, reactionary methods taken quickly, or else not only I think you're going to lose the business, I think the people will follow the licensing regimes, if you will, and the regulatory compliance other places. So a little bit of a contrarian view perhaps on that. Haven't given up on Hong Kong, but I do think as we see it and as we do advise on it, there are a lot of people doing it a lot better than I think we, even in Asia, I think are doing it. I think people are being a little bit too herd mentality here to figure out what should be the next steps.
But Hong Kong have all the right people and infrastructure and the push from the government and the industry to do it. I'm really positive about it. And what I think is, as you're right, we're paying a bit of catch up. So if the regulators can keep an open mind and the industry keep building, innovating, and educating, I'm sure we will head to the right direction.
I'm going to ask the last question, and if there's any questions from the audience, but what do you think then, having had this discussion about what do you think Hong Kong regulators can do? We're being asked this actually quite often. What do you think Hong Kong needs to do? my personal view is you need to have a legislative overhaul. You need to have a lot of legal reform, quite frankly. We haven't had any new laws passed in quite some time in Hong Kong, especially the SFC, and SFO hasn't been amended for quite some time. So what do you think, where do you think we could do better? What could we, if we were giving advice to the regulators, I don't know if there's any here, but if we were giving advice to regulators, what would that be, and how long do we think it would take to implement it?
Yeah, I think keep an open mind. Retrain yourself, retrain your people. We are definitely going to Web3 or at least a defined situation, right? That's unstoppable. So we have to do something about it. And as I said, right, the industry wants to be regulated. They want to know what they can or cannot do. And consumer like myself, I need to know that my interests are protected when I'm doing this Web3 and define and using all this new product, right? So I think clear regulations will very much needed, but these regulations need to be tailored to the new product and business model.
Would you take what we have, or would you develop something new?
I think we need something new, yeah.
And who do you think should be the regulator?
You, Kristi.
Yeah. Not my place. No, thank you. As I said, thankless task being a regulator, I think. Tell everyone no and then be happy with that decision. But do you think it should be, some people actually say, well, the HKMA's got a more vibrant sandbox. They've got a better fintech regulatory. Some people say, no, it's clearly within the SFC because of the fact we want to do security token offerings. I don't know, or do we need to set up something completely new?
Yeah, I think we might probably need to, we look at other jurisdictions, right? You can see in the US, there's so many departments involved. In the business, I don't know who to go to, and nobody can give me a definite answer. And some other jurisdictions have a one-stop shop, which is a lot easier. So I don't know what is the correct answer. I think in Hong Kong, HKM plus SFC as a hybrid could work, but I do want some guidance and clarity on this space. I agree we need that.
So with that, we left a few minutes at the end of our discussion to see if there are any questions or any other comments that might want to be talked about, because, we already have a taker. And I'm not sure, Scott, whether I'm going to allow you to speak.
Hi there, this is Steve. Just a quick question. Do you guys have any practical advice for players already on the ground in Hong Kong as to how we can comply with the local laws and regulations in terms of compliance in the Web3 era?
Yeah, so I think that's a great question. I'll go ahead and take it, and then Alice can add on if there's anything. No, I was going to say if she wants to add on to it. I think in Hong Kong, you've got to basically, and I would say that because I am a lawyer, but I think you've got to basically get with somebody who knows this space pretty inside and out. There's lots of different compliance professionals. There's law firms. There's lots of different people that basically can assist you on that. But I think the first thing you have to do is you have to look at your business model, and you have to be honest with yourself of, do you think you need to be regulated? Because if you think you need to be regulated, guess what? You probably are on the right path of saying you probably do need to be regulated. If you're not sure, though, and you're really saying, well, it's something I could basically take a guess at, that's probably will work for some time. But I think Hong Kong's doing one thing for sure. They're getting pretty serious about clamping down because of consumer protection. So I think, when it comes to retail, I think they're pretty serious, whether it be the SFC or the HKMA. So I think you have to be very, very clever that when you change and also pivot your business model, because things change, people pivot. You need to then go for another health check, so to speak, and you need to go make sure that what you've done on the pivot doesn't trigger anything, because a lot of people say, well, I only did X or Y, but by doing X or Y, you've actually really triggered some sort of regulatory compliance issue. The one big one is just, and I'm sure everyone in the room's heard this very fantastic legal word called a collective investment scheme. The fact is that you can trip into that pretty easily, which becomes a security, which takes you down that rabbit hole. And the SFC is very, very, as we all know, very prolific in prosecuting people in the crypto space and people that are out there doing things that are regulated activities without being licensed. So I think the fact is you just have to kind of surround yourself around people that are in the know, and make sure that you basically, I think, hold your hand up when you don't know something and you say, I don't know this, can I please, come have a chat. This industry, I have to say, and these people in this room, you learn a heck of a lot from people when you attend these things too, and say, well, have you thought of that, or can you think of this, or maybe come up with solutions rather than more problems. That's what we like to think we do at DLA Piper, but sometimes we don't know the answers ourselves. Maybe Alice, you can add to that.
I totally agree. I think this is particularly more important for startups because startups at the beginning, they think, oh, let's launch the product first and then we'll deal with the compliance and those issues later because that's not immediate, it's not a risk to start with. But then actually it will cost you so much more time and issue later because you might have to redo your structure. A lot of people, go together and launch a product and open a company without a shareholders agreement. So that sort of thing, those are things that people always miss and think that they can deal with it later on, or they have a structure that without thinking through, but then they have to reorganize everything, and then there's so much more cost involved. Yeah, I think for startup, if cost is an issue, we can always have government support, right? So this is Start Me Up Hong Kong Festival. So Invest Hong Kong are here to help, I think. I see Jane here, Hi. So yeah, Hong Kong have a lot of resources for you, so for startup or mature business.
Great. Any other questions I was going to say before the next panel? Happy to take them afterwards as well, but there being none. Thank you very much. Thank you for your time, and thank you for your attendance today.